The dusty streets of Silver Creek stretched endlessly under the scorching Texas sun of 1885. Jake Morrison stood motionless on the wooden porch of the saloon, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the stagecoach disappear into the horizon. Inside that coach sat Elena Martinez, the woman who had shared his bed and his secrets for 3 long years, now heading toward a new life he could never give her. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust through the small frontier town, but Jake could still smell the faint trace of Elena's lavender perfume that lingered on his shirt. His dark eyes, hardened by years of cattle drives and harsh winters, now held a pain he had never experienced during his worst days on the range. The cowboys and townspeople moved around him, going about their daily business, but Jake felt as though time had stopped entirely. Elena had been more than just his companion. She had been the light in his cabin during the long winter months, the gentle voice that soothed his restless spirit after difficult days herding cattle across the vast Texas plains. She had mended his clothes, cooked his meals, and listened to his dreams of someday owning a larger spread. But dreams, Jake had learned, were not enough to keep a woman when she yearned for respectability and security. The decision had not come suddenly. For months, Elena had grown quieter, more distant. She would stare out the window of their small cabin on the outskirts of town, watching the married women of Silver Creek as they walked to church on Sunday mornings with their children and their husbands. Jake knew what she was thinking, but he had been too proud and too afraid to acknowledge it. Marriage meant responsibility, commitment, and a life tied down to one place. For a man who had spent his adult years following cattle herds across the open range, the idea terrified him more than facing down a charging bull. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago when Sheriff William Hayes had begun courting Elena openly. Hayes was everything Jake was not: established, respectable, and ready to offer marriage. He owned a house in town, had a steady income, and commanded respect from every citizen in Silver Creek. When Elena mentioned his visits during their evening meals, Jake had remained silent, believing that his years with her meant more than the sheriff's promises. He had been wrong. Now, as the dust settled back onto the empty road, Jake reflected on the conversation that had ended everything. Elena had stood in their cabin, her dark hair pulled back neatly, wearing the blue dress he had bought her for her birthday. Her eyes had been filled with tears, but her voice had been steady and determined. "I cannot live this way anymore, Jake," she had said, folding her few possessions into a worn leather satchel. "I am 26 years old and I want children, a home, a husband who is not ashamed to be seen with me in church." Jake had tried to argue, to explain that his feelings for her were real and deep, but the words had come out clumsy and inadequate. He was a man of action, not words, and when words were needed most, he had failed her. Elena had listened patiently, but her mind was already made up. Sheriff Hayes had proposed, offering her everything Jake had been too stubborn to provide. The saloon doors swung open behind him, and his friend Tom Bradley stepped onto the porch, spitting tobacco juice into the street. Tom had worked alongside Jake for 15 years, through good seasons and bad, and he understood his friend's pain without needing explanations. She made her choice. "Jake," Tom said quietly, settling against the rail beside him, "ain't nothing left to do now but respect it." Jake nodded slowly, knowing Tom was right, but feeling the weight of regret settling on his shoulders like a heavy saddle. 3 years of shared mornings, quiet evenings, and whispered conversations in the dark had ended with a stagecoach ride to the county seat, where Eleanor would become Mrs. William Hayes within the week. The afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Elena had always loved. Jake finally turned away from the empty road and walked back into the saloon, where the familiar sounds of cards shuffling and glasses clinking offered a temporary escape from the ache in his chest. 6 months had passed since Elena's departure, and the autumn of 1885 brought cooler winds and shorter days to Silver Creek. Jake had thrown himself into his work with desperate intensity, taking on extra cattle drives and spending weeks at a time on the range. The physical exhaustion helped numb the constant ache in his chest, but it could not silence the thoughts that plagued him during the quiet moments around the campfire. The wedding had taken place in early September, just as Elena had planned. Jake had not attended, but the entire town had buzzed with talk of the ceremony for weeks afterward. Sheriff Hayes had spared no expense, bringing in a preacher from San Antonio and hosting a reception at the town hall that lasted well into the evening. The local newspaper had even written a lengthy article about the union, describing Elena's white lace dress and the elaborate decorations that had transformed the simple church into something worthy of a big city celebration. Jake had read every word of that article, torturing himself with details of Elena's happiness. The newspaper described her radiant smile and the way she had looked at her new husband during the ceremony. It mentioned the gifts from prominent townspeople, the feast that followed, and the couple's plans to honeymoon in Austin before returning to their new home on Maple Street. The house Sheriff Hayes had purchased for his bride was everything Jake's cabin was not. It sat on the respectable side of town, with a white picket fence, a well-tended garden, and lace curtains in every window. Jake had ridden past it several times, unable to stop himself from looking for signs of Elena's presence. Her touch was evident in the flower boxes beneath the windows and the way the curtains were arranged, but he had never caught a glimpse of her through the glass. Tom Bradley had grown concerned about his friend's state of mind. Jake had always been a quiet man, but now he spoke even less, preferring the company of cattle to that of other cowboys. When they returned to town after their drives, Jake would immediately head to the saloon, where he would sit alone at a corner table, nursing whiskey until closing time. The other men had learned to leave him be, recognizing the dangerous edge in his eyes that suggested any interference would be unwelcome. On this particular evening, Jake sat in his usual spot, watching the amber liquid in his glass catch the lamplight. The saloon was busier than usual, filled with cowboys celebrating the end of a successful cattle drive. Their laughter and boisterous conversations created a wall of noise that Jake found oddly comforting, as it helped drown out his own thoughts. The saloon doors swung open, and Sheriff Hayes entered, his badge gleaming on his vest. The lawman's presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room, as several of the more rowdy patrons quieted their voices and straightened their postures. Hayes nodded to the bartender and ordered a beer, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to maintaining order. Jake felt his jaw tighten as he watched the man who had taken Elena away from him. Hayes was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair at his temples that gave him a distinguished appearance. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world, and his expensive clothes marked him as someone of means and status. Everything about him represented the respectability that Jake had been unable to offer Elena. As if sensing his scrutiny, Hayes turned and met Jake's gaze across the smoky room. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of unspoken history hanging between them. Hayes knew exactly who Jake was and what he had meant to Elena. The sheriff's expression remained neutral, but Jake detected a hint of something that might have been pity in his eyes. Unable to bear the silent confrontation any longer, Jake drained his glass and stood abruptly. He tossed a coin onto the table and strode toward the doors, his spurs jingling with each step. As he passed Hayes, the sheriff spoke quietly, his voice barely audible above the din of conversation. "She asks about you sometimes," Hayes said, not looking directly at Jake. "Wonders if you are taking care of yourself." Jake paused, his hand on the saloon door. The words hit him like a physical blow, confirming what he had both hoped and feared. That Elena still thought of him, that their 3 years together had not been forgotten in her new life of domestic bliss. He wanted to ask for more details, to know what she had said and how she had looked when she mentioned him. But his pride would not allow such questions. Instead, he pushed through the doors without responding and stepped into the cool night air. Behind him, the sounds of the saloon continued, but Jake felt more alone than ever. The knowledge that Elena still remembered him should have brought comfort, but it only deepened his regret. He had lost the most important thing in his life through his own stubbornness and fear, and no amount of whiskey or hard work could change that reality. Winter settled over Silver Creek with an unusual harshness that year, bringing snow and ice that made travel treacherous and kept most folks close to their fires. Jake had decided to remain in town, rather than attempt the dangerous journey to the winter grazing lands, taking odd jobs around Silver Creek to earn enough money for food and lodging. The decision proved fortunate when a blizzard struck in late December, trapping the entire town under 3 feet of snow for nearly a week. It was during this enforced isolation that Jake first saw Elena again since her wedding day. He had been shoveling snow from the front of Murphy's General Store when she emerged from the building, carefully navigating the icy boardwalk with a basket of supplies balanced on her arm. She wore a thick woolen coat and a blue bonnet that framed her face beautifully, but Jake noticed immediately that something had changed about her. The radiant happiness that had been described in the wedding announcement was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a quiet sadness that seemed to weigh down her shoulders. Their eyes met across the snowy street, and for a moment, neither moved. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs as memories of their shared mornings flooded back. Elena's expression softened, and she offered a small, tentative smile that contained both warmth and pain. Jake touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, unsure of what else to do in such a public setting. The moment was broken when Sheriff Hayes appeared at Elena's side, taking her arm with a possessive gesture that Jake found irritating. Hayes nodded curtly to Jake before guiding his wife away from the store, their footsteps crunching through the snow as they made their way toward their home on Maple Street. Jake watched them go, noting how Elena seemed to lean away from her husband rather than toward him, and how her steps lacked the spring that had once characterized her walk. Over the following weeks, as the snow gradually melted and normal life resumed in Silver Creek, Jake found himself watching for glimpses of Elena whenever he was in town. He learned her patterns. Tuesday mornings at the general store, Thursday afternoons at the church for ladies' auxiliary meetings, and Sunday services where she sat in the front pew beside her husband. Each sighting brought a mixture of joy and agony, as he could see more clearly, with each encounter, that married life was not bringing Elena the happiness she had sought. The truth became undeniable one cold February morning when Jake encountered Elena alone at the creek that ran behind the town. She had been drawing water from the partially frozen stream, struggling with the heavy bucket in her weakened state. Without thinking, Jake approached and took the bucket from her hands, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "You should not be doing such heavy work," Jake said quietly, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her coat hung loosely on her diminished frame. Elena looked around nervously, clearly aware of the impropriety of speaking with him alone. "William is away on county business," she explained. "He will return this evening." Jake carried the bucket to her wagon, which was hitched to a tired-looking mare that had seen better days. As he loaded the water, he noticed other signs of financial strain: the worn harness, the patched blanket covering the seat, and the meager supplies that suggested the Hayes household was not as prosperous as appearances suggested. "Eleanor," Jake began, turning to face her. "Are you well? You look tired," she finished for him, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Marriage is more work than I expected, Jake. William has many demands, and the house requires constant attention." Jake wanted to ask more questions, to understand what had caused the light to dim in her eyes. But Elena was already climbing into her wagon. She paused before taking up the reins, looking back at him with an expression that contained years of unspoken words. "I think of our cabin sometimes," she said softly. "How peaceful the mornings were, how simple everything seemed then. I did not realize what I was giving up when I chose respectability." Before Jake could respond, she urged the mare into motion, leaving him standing beside the creek with his heart pounding and his mind racing. Her words confirmed what he had suspected, that Elena's marriage to Sheriff Hayes was not the fairy tale ending she had envisioned. The respectability she had craved had come at a cost she had not anticipated, and now she was trapped in a life that brought her neither joy nor fulfillment. That evening, Jake sat in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and considering Elena's revelation. Tom Bradley joined him at his table, noting the troubled expression on his friend's face. "Saw you talking to Mrs. Hayes today," Tom said carefully. "Folks might start to talk if they see you together." Jake nodded, understanding the warning. In a small town like Silver Creek, reputation was everything, and any hint of impropriety could destroy Elena's already fragile position. But the knowledge that she was unhappy ate at him like a persistent wound. He had let her go once, believing it was for her own good. Now he wondered if his silence and inaction were causing her even greater pain. Spring arrived early in 1886, bringing with it a series of events that would forever change the lives of everyone in Silver Creek. Jake had spent the winter months wrestling with his conscience, torn between his desire to help Eleanor and his respect for the boundaries of her marriage. The brief encounter by the creek had haunted him through the cold months, and he found himself riding past the Hayes house more frequently, watching for signs of Elena's well-being. The first crack in the facade of respectability came in March, when rumors began circulating about Sheriff Hayes's gambling debts. The weekly poker games that had once been dismissed as harmless entertainment were revealed to involve substantial sums of money that Hayes could not afford to lose. Merchants began whispering about unpaid bills, and the bank president was seen visiting the Hayes residence on multiple occasions, his expression grim and businesslike. Jake learned the full extent of the situation from Doc Henderson, who had been called to treat Elena after she had collapsed during a church service. The doctor, sworn to professional secrecy but clearly concerned about his patient, confided in Jake that Elena was suffering from exhaustion and malnutrition, symptoms that suggested she was not receiving proper care at home. "That woman is wasting away," Doc Henderson said, shaking his head as he packed his medical bag. "She needs rest, good food, and less worry. Instead, she's working herself to the bone trying to keep up appearances while her husband gambles away their future." The breaking point came on a rainy April evening when Jake was returning from a cattle drive. As he rode through the muddy streets of Silver Creek, he heard shouting coming from the direction of Maple Street. Following the sound, he arrived at the Hayes house to find Elena standing on the front porch, her belongings scattered around her feet, while Sheriff Hayes stood in the doorway with his face flushed red from anger and whiskey. "I will not live with a woman who questions my judgment," Hayes was shouting, his words slurred and his stance unsteady. "If you cannot respect your husband's decisions, then you can find somewhere else to live." Elena stood in the rain, her dark hair plastered to her head and her simple dress soaked through. She clutched a small satchel to her chest, the same one she had carried when she left Jake's cabin nearly 2 years earlier. Her face was pale but determined, and Jake could see that she had finally reached the limit of her endurance. "William, please," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I only asked where the money for food would come from. The cupboards are empty and the bills—" "The bills are my concern," Hayes interrupted, swaying dangerously in the doorway. "A wife should trust her husband to provide, not nag him about every penny spent. Now get off my property before I have you arrested for disturbing the peace." Jake had heard enough. Despite every instinct telling him to stay out of another man's domestic affairs, he could not stand by and watch Elena be treated with such cruelty. He dismounted from his horse and approached the porch, his boots splashing through the muddy puddles. "Mrs. Hayes needs shelter," Jake said firmly, addressing the sheriff with the same calm tone he used to handle spooked cattle. "A gentleman does not put a lady out in the rain, regardless of their disagreements." Hayes turned his bleary gaze on Jake, recognition dawning slowly in his intoxicated mind. "Jake Morrison," he sneered, "come to collect what you think belongs to you. Well, you can have her. She is more trouble than she is worth, always asking questions, always worrying about money." Elena looked between the two men, her eyes wide with fear and embarrassment. The neighbors had begun to gather at their windows, drawn by the commotion, and she was acutely aware that her private shame was becoming public spectacle. "I have a place to go," she said quietly, lifting her chin with dignity, despite her bedraggled appearance. "I will not be a burden to anyone." But Jake knew she had nowhere to turn. Her family lived far away in Mexico, and she had no close friends in Silver Creek who would risk their reputations by harboring a woman who had been cast out by her husband. The boarding house would not accept a woman without references, and she had no money to pay for lodging, even if they would. "You will stay at my cabin," Jake said simply, not caring who heard him or what they might think. "It is dry and warm, and you will be safe there." Sheriff Hayes laughed bitterly, leaning against the doorframe for support. "Perfect. The whore returns to her cowboy. At least now, everyone will know what she really is." The insult hung in the air like a physical blow. Jake felt his hands clench into fists, and for a moment, he considered teaching the drunken sheriff some manners with his knuckles. But Elena placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch cooling his anger and reminding him that violence would only make the situation worse. "Thank you, Jake," she said softly, gathering her scattered belongings with whatever dignity she could muster. "I accept your offer, at least until I can make other arrangements." As they walked away from the Hayes house, Elena riding behind Jake on his horse while her few possessions were tied to his saddle, neither spoke of the weight of the decision they had just made. Elena had chosen survival over respectability, while Jake had chosen compassion over caution. Both understood that their lives had just taken a turn from which there might be no return. The summer of 1886 brought changes to Silver Creek that no one could have predicted. Elena's return to Jake's cabin had caused a scandal that dominated conversation in every saloon, church, and general store in town. The respectable ladies whispered behind their fans about fallen women and moral corruption, while the men debated whether Jake had acted as a gentleman or a fool. Through it all, Jake and Elena remained focused on rebuilding their lives together, this time with a deeper understanding of what they meant to each. Elena had spent the first weeks recovering from the physical and emotional toll of her marriage to Sheriff Hayes. Jake tended to her with a gentleness that surprised them both, bringing her warm meals and allowing her the time and space she needed to heal. Slowly, her strength returned, along with the spark in her eyes that he had fallen in love with years earlier. But this Elena was different from the woman who had left him. She was wiser, more cautious, and carried scars that would never fully fade. Sheriff Hayes had made no attempt to reclaim his wife or apologize for his behavior. Instead, he had thrown himself deeper into gambling and drinking, becoming a source of embarrassment for the town council. By midsummer, his debts had grown so substantial that he was forced to sell his house on Maple Street to pay his creditors. The man who had once represented respectability and stability had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of vice and poor judgment. One evening in late July, as Jake and Elena sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, she finally spoke about her marriage and the mistakes that had led to its failure. "I thought respectability was the same thing as happiness," she said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I believed that if I could become Mrs. Hayes, if I could have a house in town and attend church services as a married woman, then I would finally be content. But respectability without love is just an empty shell, Jake. It looks proper from the outside, but there is nothing real inside." Jake reached over and took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his own. "I should have fought for you," he admitted. "I should have asked you to marry me before Hayes ever had the chance. My pride and my fear cost us both dearly." Elena squeezed his fingers, her touch warm and reassuring. "We were both afraid of different things. You feared being tied down, and I feared being left behind. But perhaps we needed to lose each other to understand what we truly had." The conversation they had avoided for months finally came naturally that evening. Jake proposed to Elena as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, offering her not just his love, but his commitment to building a real partnership together. This time, there were no doubts or hesitations. Elena accepted immediately, tears of joy replacing the sadness that had shadowed her eyes for so long. They were married in September, exactly 1 year after Elena's wedding to Sheriff Hayes. The ceremony was small and simple, held in the cabin where they had first lived together, with Tom Bradley and Doc Henderson serving as witnesses. There were no elaborate decorations or fancy reception, just two people making honest promises to each other about the life they would build together. The town's reaction was mixed. Some viewed their marriage as scandalous, the union of a divorced woman and the man who had taken her back. Others, particularly those who had witnessed Sheriff Hayes' decline, saw it as a love story with a happy ending. But Jake and Elena had learned not to live their lives according to other people's opinions. They had found their way back to each other despite the obstacles, and that was all that mattered. By winter, Elena was pregnant with their first child, and Jake had purchased additional land to expand their cattle operation. The success of their ranch, built on hard work and mutual respect, gradually won over even their harshest critics. Elena became known throughout the territory for her skill with horses, while Jake's reputation as an honest dealer made their brand sought after by buyers from as far away as Kansas City. Years later, when their children asked about their parents' courtship, Jake and Elena would tell them about the importance of fighting for love, even when it seems lost. They spoke of second chances and the courage required to admit mistakes and start over. Most importantly, they taught their children that true partnership requires both people to choose each other every day, not just on their wedding day. Sheriff Hayes eventually left Silver Creek, his reputation and finances in ruins. He was never seen in the territory again, becoming just another cautionary tale told around campfires and in saloons. Jake felt no satisfaction in the man's downfall, only gratitude that Elena had found the strength to leave before it was too late. As Jake held his wife close on their 10th wedding anniversary, watching their children play in the yard of their prosperous ranch, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years with Elena as his mistress had taught him about passion and companionship. Losing her had taught him about regret and the cost of pride. But winning her back and marrying her had taught him the most valuable lesson of all, that love worth having is love worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes or what obstacles stand in the way.